Hello and welcome to the very first episode of the West Sussex Safer Communities podcast. My name is Scarlett and I'm a project officer within the community safety team at West Sussex County Council. We are launching this podcast to give residents of the county, as well as listeners from further afield, a view into the wide range of work that goes on under the umbrella of community safety. The following episodes were produced in conjunction with the Digital Safety and Fraud Prevention team, whose role is to raise online safety and fraud awareness amongst our communities, businesses and services across West Sussex. In addition to running events and training, the team provide top tips and advice to help us stay safe online and raise awareness of fraud types and how to avoid them. I am very lucky to be joined today by Lisa from Victim Support, who'll be with us over the next few episodes to share her expertise on romance and relationship fraud.
Thank you, Scarlett. Hi, everybody. My name is Lisa Mills. I'm the Senior Fraud Manager within Victim Support Sussex. Victim Support is an independent charity which is dedicated to supporting people affected by crime and traumatic incidents in England and Wales. We provide specialist services to help people manage after crime and to empower them to ensure that their voices are heard individually and collectively at a local and national level.
Great, thank you, Lisa. It's fantastic to have you here. Thank you for coming along. Before we get into the content of the episode, we'd like to provide a content warning for listeners. The particularities of romance and relationship fraud can be pretty shocking and harrowing, and listeners should take care. So if you're personally impacted by anything which we discuss in today's episode, please do contact Victim Support. You can find the details for your local team on their website, and you can also use an online chat on their website or telephone their 24/7 support line on 0808 16 89 111. To get us started, it would be great if Lisa could give us a summary of what exactly is romance and relationship fraud. I know I didn't fully appreciate this form of kind of criminal activity until I joined my current role in the community safety team.
Absolutely, and I don't think you're alone in that prior lack of awareness around this crime type. So romance and relationship fraud happens when someone is deceived by a criminal into thinking they are in a genuine friendship or a romantic relationship. This type of fraud can take place online or in a face-to-face setting, and sadly this bond of trust which is formed between two people is a false scenario to enable criminals to financially exploit their victims. And it is something that we've seen increase year on year and sadly affects people across all ages from all backgrounds.
Thank you for that. It's so important, I think, to make people aware of what exactly we're dealing with. And I think there's also a misconception that this type of fraud is relatively rare. So it's great to just straight off the bat spell out that that's not the case. I know from reading the quarterly fraud report, which is produced by Operation Signature team at Sussex Police, that especially in West Sussex, it's actually very widespread. Its romance and relationship fraud is regularly the second highest reported fraud type at 14.4% across Sussex.
That's right, and people may be surprised to hear that, and perhaps today is the first time that they're getting insight into this type of fraud. And I can say, as somebody that supports victims on the front line, that romance and relationship fraud does cause significant and lasting harm to a huge number of victims. So between January and December of 2024, Victim Support Specialist Fraud Support Service received 310 referrals relating to romance fraud, and this was just in Sussex alone. So if this was to be replicated within victim support services nationally, you do begin to get a sense of the scale of impacted victims. Following on from that, we can say that fraud is very underreported, and fraud accounts now for around 40% of all reported crime in the UK. And I think there's many reasons why people fail to report fraud, but a big factor around that is because of the stigma and shame around reporting and the negative connotations which exist in society about the type of people who experience this form of crime. Therefore, we can only really imagine what the true figure of people that have been subjected to this kind of abuse may be. Additionally, there are many victims who are not coming forward to receive the type of support which they deserve and who may not be aware that there is support out there for them, So hopefully today we can reinforce the message that becoming a victim of fraud is never your fault, and victim support will be there to help you.
Yeah, I mean, that's so important to just get that out there in the first episode. That, you know, if you have experienced this yourself, or you know someone who has experienced it, it's so important to go out there and get the support that you need. Within that kind of stigma and shame, I imagine there are also some pretty harmful stereotypes about the kinds of people that are victims of this fraud type. So I think it'd be good for us to do a bit of kind of myth busting and talk about who exactly is kind of falling victim to romance and relationship fraud. And I say falling with kind of quotes around it because that kind of language is used pretty regularly. But Lisa would want to push back against that, I think.
Definitely, Scarlett. And that is such a key word that is used so often, the word fall. So this just reinforces that the victim is to blame for what's happened. So when we use the word fall in terms of fraud, it is very much specific to that crime type, I feel, because we would never hear of people being described as falling for a burglary, would we? So that's the first bit of myth busting I would like to address, because, as I say, it implies that the victim has invited this harm onto themselves and should have done more to protect themselves, which I can categorically say is not the case, because they have been coerced, they have been groomed, and it's never the victim's fault. So in terms of a typical victim of romance and relationship fraud, we can say that there is no such thing. We can talk about vulnerabilities, but similarly, we can also talk about our susceptibility, because we are human, aren't we? And we don't always get things right. So I'm sure we can all identify with times in our lives when we're not quite at our best, and we all have off days, don't we? Whether that's due to ill health, unexpected bad news, or simply from having a poor night's sleep. So it is at times like this when fraudsters can come into our lives and begin to socially engineer themselves into a position where we trust them. Therefore, there is often no inner voice which warns us that such individuals are solely focused on causing us harm.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think if you look at the data as well on who is reporting romance and relationship fraud, particularly in West Sussex, you might be led to assume that a certain demographic is the only group at risk. For example, from October to December 2024, 76% of victims of this fraud type were aged 75 or over, 69% of victims were female, and 67% were living alone. And you might say this is kind of a typical case, like you said, but even just in West Sussex, people as young as kind of 30, even living with long-term partners in loving relationships, also have experiences of romance and relationship fraud. So certain groups may be more susceptible, but no one's immune. And regardless of these factors that might make someone more vulnerable to fraudsters, whether you're having a bad day or not, like Lisa said, the individuals kind of perpetuating romance and relationship fraud, they're intelligent, they're primed to kind of start these conversations with something that's relevant to each potential victim. They've done their research, and this makes it more likely that a victim will kind of continue this conversation past that initial interaction. And sadly, this is pretty true for all scams.
And I would say, Scarlett, for this type of fraud, it's not simply the case that somebody's got up in the morning, had a conversation with somebody and thought, let me hand some money over to them. It is so much more complex than that, because we can appreciate that when we form a romantic connection or a relationship with another person, we are going to naturally open up to them. We are in a contact relationship with somebody, we want to move it forward. So on an emotional level, it can be challenging to perhaps rationalise and keep your emotions in check when you feel the sense of excitement at having connected with someone who you see as your perfect romantic partner, or someone you have bonded with strongly in another interpersonal capacity.
Absolutely. And I think that, that sense of kind of opening up, we're encouraged to open up in our interactions with other people, in romantic relationships and platonic relationships. So, doing that could not say, how is that a bad thing? I'm, being vulnerable and opening up, and that's kind of inherently good. This takes us kind of perfectly onto my next question, which I think is a really interesting aspect of the conversations about romance and relationship fraud, which is about the kind of psychology behind it, and also how criminal methods might have changed over the years. So fraud kind of depends on the ability to deceive. So how exactly are criminals going about this deception?
So for criminals, it's very much a business method. They have honed their skills over the years, and a key factor is their use of emotive language. So, for example, people may have heard the expression love bombing. They will start a relationship with somebody and it will be very intense. They will be expressing their love for somebody. They might even propose to somebody quite early on. So it's a grooming pattern. They will mould themselves into your perfect partner, and they may have had help in doing this. For example, if your security settings are quite open on your social media profiles, then criminals will be actively trawling information like that. So by the time you start speaking to them, you feel that you have a genuine connection. Another form of manipulation that they employ is by isolating their victim from any existing support networks that they may have available. So it is in the criminal's best interest to prevent any possible third-party intervention that may break the spell that they have the victim under. So in simple terms, it could be that if a member of your family or someone close to you finds out that you're talking to somebody, then they may think something feels suspicious and try and divert what you're doing and try and change your behaviour. And clearly that's the last thing that a criminal wants. Another element that I would like to make people aware of is something called sextortion. So this is a type of online blackmail where criminals threaten to share sexual pictures, videos, or information about you. So it could be that victims have previously shared such material, or that the criminal has manipulated images of their victims onto a picture or within a video. Understandably, victims of this are greatly traumatised and can feel compelled into sending money to the blackmailer in an attempt to prevent such images being more widely shared. We have seen a fair number of people that have become victim to this sort of crime, but the advice I would give is to definitely report what's happening and do not send any money to that person attempting to blackmail you.
Absolutely, and as I imagine is the case with lots of different types of blackmail, the perpetrator is going to be saying, don't contact anybody, you really trying to isolate you from having any kind of advice, putting the pressure on you in terms of kind of time frame, and if you don't send me money by this time, everything will be released. And it's interesting this comes up. Our team actually knows a fair amount about sextortion. So the community safety team launched a project specifically focused on this crime type back in 2023. So the name sextortion, if you're not aware, is short for financially motivated sexual extortion. Pretty horrible list of words strung together. And the victim demographic data actually shows that young males aged 14 to 17 are often the main target of this crime type. That's not to say that other groups, other demographics won't be targeted, but this is quite unusual, as we often think of fraud as older people being more vulnerable. This shows just how wide the reach of these criminals really is. They really are coming at every kind of part of the population from a different angle. So we've been working with a group of local Year 10 students to develop some resources to help raise awareness. So kind of creating those resources by and for young people to try and get people clued up on what's happening. So it's great to see so many different projects going on in this space.
That's right, and it is about awareness, and for people's awareness, I'll introduce something else that we have seen increase in, which is a hybrid really of romance and investment fraud. So it has a very unpleasant name, but I will say it so that people are aware of it. So it's often called pig butchering. So very distasteful, and by the very nature of the name, it will perhaps dissuade people from coming forward. But once again, I would say that please do not feel ashamed if you have lost money in this way. So how it will work, the fraudster will present this as a special investment opportunity that they are bringing to the attention of their partner. So it is a variation on asking for money directly for themselves, even though the flow of this investment money is still intended for the criminal's own fraudulent purposes. And in our team's own experience, we have seen victims that have been persuaded to invest in a fake company that their love has set up, and other opportunities where people have lost hundreds of thousands of pounds. But of course, like all fraud, the amount of money really is irrelevant. It comes down to the emotional and psychological harm that victim is put through, and in some cases the many long-lasting impacts that will have on the victim for a number of years to come.
Absolutely, and as you say, in terms of the kind of emotional as well as financial impact, I assume that this kind of hybrid fraud might have the potential to be kind of doubly harmful to victims as well. It's so important to stay on top of recent fraud trends, so thank you, Lisa, for kind of spelling out some of those things that you're seeing emerging in the space. And it's so important that we do this so we can kind of change our approaches to perpetrators as well as victims. So are there any other ways that you've kind of seen romance and relationship fraud develop over time?
So we need to just touch upon AI, so artificial intelligence, for a little bit now. Although we've not seen a great deal of it coming into our support cases locally, we do need to be mindful of the development of AI. So it will be used for many productive purposes going forward, but unfortunately it will also be flipped for negative purposes by fraudsters within the criminal community. So going back a few years, we were used to seeing victims being provided with photos that had been doctored by a criminal in order to verify a type of scenario that a fraudster was presenting to them. Quite commonly, somebody would claim to have been arrested overseas, their passport had been taken, and they needed money, for example, for help with lawyers' fees. Additionally, victims could also be provided with videos that had been digitally altered, often showing a person speaking to them. But the fraudster would say that they weren't unable to respond in real time because of a technical issue. And therefore the conversation wasn't interactive, and the victim, although they couldn't speak back, they were satisfied that because they saw their partner on screen, that it was a genuine interaction. I think unfortunately now, because of the way that technology is advancing, we cannot stick to the same messaging. So before we would used to tell people to look out for eye and lip movements that didn't seem genuine and wouldn't be in line with how a normal person would speak. So enhancements now are making it harder to detect certain contacts as fake. But when we talk about looking out for red flags, I think the general information I can give people is just to still be cautious when engaging with a person that you've met online.
Absolutely. And, you know, as you've spelled out, the online world really is changing and developing at such an alarming rate, as we all know, as, you know, the online world is more and more integrated with our day-to-day lives. Everybody's aware of these kind of changes. There are so many different conversations going on around AI and its capacity for good as well as harm. But I think it's really important to contextualise these conversations and think about how the technology could actually be used to make existing forms of fraud even more harmful. So, you know, we're not scaremongering, going, oh God, the AI is going to take over the world and stuff like that. It's, you know, we're thinking about the crimes that are actually already happening and how they could be changed to kind of dodge, like you said, messaging around red flags and things like that, making, you know, the crimes even more harmful. So now we've spoken a bit about the kind of toolbox available to romance and relationship fraudsters. I'd like to take the conversation back to the group that victim support do their important work with, so the victims. Could you tell us what exactly is the impact of this fraud type on victims, as well as their support networks, and how can organisations like Victim Support help?
So being victimised by fraud does lead people to extremely dark and isolating places. It does have severe impacts on both their physical and mental well-being, and many victims do feel reluctant to share what has happened with their family and close friends for fear of being judged and looked at in a different way. So we do find that sometimes their caseworker within victim support may be the first person they felt able to open up to about what they've experienced. And as I've touched on before, the emotional, psychological and financial consequences of fraud can be many and varied and will have life-changing consequences on a person's well-being going forwards. And we shouldn't forget that it's not just the victim that can be impacted, it's also friends, family members, the victim's wider support network. And that can be doubly hard if the person you're trying to support remains in denial about what is happening to them. And Victim Support is a charity within England and Wales. We have a fantastic network of staff and volunteer supporters across the country. So I would encourage listeners to take a look at our website, and separately we also have resources available at something called My Support Space, which you can easily find online. So generally speaking, if you come into our service, you will be supported. We will look to see what your immediate support needs are and what may be beneficial to you longer term. I can say within our local service, we do also work with victims in financial advocacy. So we help victims to approach their banks about their fraud losses, and we can also give them information about the remit of the Financial Ombudsman Service, for example. So I think it's very important, because at this time when people have experienced fraud, it can be very overwhelming. There can be many different agencies that they are required to link in with. So having a central point of contact through their fraud caseworker can undoubtedly help them very much in their process to cope and recover going forwards.
Well, thank you so much for taking us through all those different options. I mean, it's great to hear that there are so many different options. I think giving kind of autonomy to victims in terms of where they want to go and what kind of support they think they need is really important. And it's also great to hear that Victim Support can advocate for victims in that space. I know, I wouldn't know where to start if I was approaching a bank about something that had happened to me like this. So being able to take a victim through the options and even helping them if they want to report the crime is so fantastic that you are able to do that work, and so broadly across the country as well.
So just for an additional bit of information for people, so if you haven't heard of Action Fraud is the UK's National Reporting Centre for Fraud and Cybercrime. So we would always recommend that a victim reports to them initially. But I do need to make it clear that this organisation doesn't investigate the fraud directly. What it will do will disseminate the information. It goes through something called the National Fraud Intelligence Bureau, and then if there are lines of inquiry, this case will then be sent to your local police force area for further action. Also, in terms of contacting your banks, since October 2024, new rules came into force determining how banks and other financial providers reimburse victims of something called authorised push payment fraud. So authorised push payment is when you have authorised a payment, but this has happened because you've been tricked by a criminal into sending money to an account which they control. And I think lastly, and obviously I'm biased, so most importantly, I will say please get in touch with Victim Support. It is important to remember that you don't need to have reported a crime to the police in order to get assistance from us. Please do get in touch with us anytime for independent, free and confidential advice.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Lisa. I think that's a great place to end our very first episode. So thank you again for providing us with some much needed insight into the world of romance and relationship fraud. We will, in the kind of description for this episode, also add all the links to the websites and support services that we talked about. I look forward to speaking to you in our next episode. So listeners, join us then. We're going to kind of put a face to the service users at Victim Support and hear from someone who has actually experienced the crime firsthand.